My name is Claire, and the day my sister tried to move into my house without asking me was the day I finally understood what my family thought I was. I heard the moving van before I saw it. Its engine rattled outside my kitchen window, followed by the sharp clatter of suitcase wheels against the sidewalk and two children arguing over something loud enough for the whole street to hear. I looked through the blinds. There was my sister, Megan, 3 kids, 6 suitcases, a rented moving van, and enough boxes to tell me this wasn't a visit. I opened the front door, still holding my coffee, and Megan smiled like I'd been expecting her. "Mom already gave us permission," she said. I actually laughed. Permission for what? To stay here, just until I get back on my feet. Behind her, one of her sons grabbed a suitcase and started toward my front steps. Something in my chest went cold, because my mother didn't own this house. She'd never paid a dollar toward it. The mortgage was in my name. The down payment had come from 8 years of overtime, skipped vacations, and a savings account I guarded like it was oxygen. Yet Megan stood there acting like the decision had already been made. And if you've ever dealt with family who treat your boundaries like suggestions, you know exactly what happened next. I told that child to put the suitcase down. Megan's smile disappeared. 20 minutes later, I discovered why. They hadn't just come to stay. They'd been planning this for months. For nearly 15 years, I was the responsible one. While Megan bounced between apartments, jobs, and whatever crisis was happening that month, I worked. While she called Mom crying about another overdue bill, I stayed late, picked up overtime, and put money into savings. By 39, I had saved almost $85,000. That number wasn't luck. It was 15 years of skipped vacations, old cars, packed lunches, and saying no to things I wanted because I wanted something bigger. A home. When I finally bought mine, I remember standing barefoot on the hardwood floor with the keys in my hand. The place smelled like fresh paint and dust. It wasn't huge, but it was mine. Megan congratulated me. Then she asked if she could borrow money. That became the pattern. The year before, she'd been facing eviction, and I paid $4,000 to keep her family in their apartment. I bought school clothes, backpacks, notebooks, and shoes for the kids. I loaned her money for groceries, car repairs, and utility bills. Most of it never came back. Whenever I hesitated, Mom, Linda, had the same answer. When you have more, you help the people who have less. She'd say it gently, like she was teaching me a moral lesson instead of handing out my money. "You make more than enough," she told me once. "Your sister has children." And somehow, every conversation ended there. If I said no, suddenly I was selfish. If I questioned Megan's spending, I was judging her. And if I tried to set a limit, Mom would ask, "So, what? You hate your nieces and nephews now?" That was the trick. They never asked whether I could afford it. They asked whether I loved them enough to sacrifice. The moment everything finally clicked happened during a family dinner. Mom casually told everyone I'd cover part of an expense for my cousin. I hadn't agreed. I hadn't even been asked. When I confronted her later, Linda sighed. "I knew you'd help." That's when I understood. In my family's mind, help wasn't something I offered anymore. It was access they believed they already had. So I started saying no, not to everything, but to more things. And instead of respecting that boundary, Megan and Mom treated it like a temporary inconvenience. I just didn't realize how far they were willing to go to get around it. 2 weeks before that moving van appeared outside my house, Megan called me on a Tuesday night. I was standing in my kitchen, rinsing dishes, when she said she'd fallen behind on rent and her lease was ending. Then, casually, she asked, "So me and the kids can stay with you for a little while, right?" I turned off the faucet. What does a little while mean? There was a pause. "I don't know, Claire. Until I figure things out." Then she added, "Mom thinks you have plenty of room." That sentence changed everything. I dried my hands and said, as calmly as I could, "Mom doesn't own my house, Megan. And neither do you. I am not agreeing to anyone moving in." Her voice hardened immediately. "Wow. So that's it? You're just abandoning your family?" "I'm not abandoning anyone." But she wasn't listening. Later that night, Linda called. Her voice had that familiar, disappointed softness. Megan is desperate. You can't seriously expect your sister and those children to figure this out alone. I offer to help. I reminded her. I'll help her find housing resources. I can contribute a limited amount toward temporary accommodation. I can watch the kids sometimes. Every option was rejected. Megan didn't want help finding a place. She wanted my place. The next morning, she called one last time. So you're really saying no? Yes. Silence. Then the calls stopped. For 14 days, nothing. No arguments. No guilt trips. No messages from Mom. I thought they'd finally accepted my answer. But standing at my front door 2 weeks later, staring at 6 suitcases and 3 children, I understood that silence differently. It hadn't been acceptance. It had been preparation. The afternoon Megan arrived. The heat was so heavy the air seemed to sit on the pavement. I opened my front door and immediately smelled diesel exhaust. The moving van idled at the curb. Suitcase wheels rattled over the concrete while the kids argued beside a stack of boxes. Megan looked up and smiled. Good, you're home. Mom said you were expecting us. I froze. Before I could answer, her oldest son grabbed a suitcase. Where's my room? He asked. Megan pointed toward my house. Go on. You kids are going to have plenty of space. No. The word came out sharper than I intended. The children stopped. So stop, I said, forcing myself to lower my voice. Nobody comes inside. Megan's smile vanished. Claire, don't start. I'm not starting anything. I already told you no. Then her phone rang. She put it on speaker. It was Linda. Claire, Mom said loudly, you cannot put 3 children on the street. My stomach twisted. There it was. The performance. They had brought the children because they knew exactly what it would look like if I refused. For one awful second, guilt almost won. I looked at those kids standing in the August heat, confused and tired, and every instinct in me wanted to solve the problem. Then Megan picked up 2 bags and walked toward my doorway. I stepped in front of her. Move. No. Claire, seriously? No one has permission to enter my house. Her face changed. She dropped the bags and started crying. Not quietly. Loudly. You're doing this to us? To your own family? Her voice carried across the street. A curtain moved in my neighbor's window. Mom kept talking through the phone, repeating that I was cruel. Then Megan's youngest said something that made everything inside me go still. But Mom said we're living here for a long time. Megan snapped her head toward him. Go sit down. Too late. I looked at the nearest box. A corner had split open. Inside were papers, school forms, and an envelope with my address printed across the front. My address. Not hers. That's when I understood. This was never a request. It was an ambush. I stepped backward, shut the door, and turned the lock. My hands were shaking so badly, I missed it the first time. On the other side, Megan started pounding. And I stood there in my own hallway, listening to my family try to force their way into a life they had already decided belonged to them. For the first few days, I barely left the house. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach tightened. Megan called. Mom called. Then cousins, an aunt I hadn't spoken to in months. Even my uncle. Megan had told her version first. According to her, I had left a mother and 3 children standing outside with nowhere to go. Nobody asked what happened before that. Nobody asked whether Megan had permission to move in. I replayed the confrontation until I couldn't sleep. Maybe I had been too harsh. Maybe I could have handled it differently. That guilt was familiar. My family had trained me to feel selfish every time I protected something of my own. But by the 4th day, something became impossible to ignore. Every message demanded an apology. Not one asked for my side. So I stopped responding. Instead, I saved everything. I screenshot the accusations. I saved voicemails. I wrote down dates, times, and exactly what happened, starting with Megan's call 2 weeks before the moving van arrived. Over the next 2 weeks, something inside me changed. The more I documented, the clearer everything became. This wasn't a misunderstanding that needed more explaining. They understood perfectly. They just didn't accept my answer. And one night, sitting alone at my kitchen table, surrounded by silence and the blue glow of my phone, I finally said it out loud. I spent years trying to convince them I was a good person. I finally understood that the argument itself was the trap. That was my turning point. I stopped trying to win their approval. I started protecting myself. And once I had the timeline, the messages, and the proof, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I didn't hire an attorney because I wanted revenge. I hired one because I wanted to know exactly where I stood. 3 weeks after Megan's moving van appeared outside my house, I sat in a small office across from a property attorney with a folder full of screenshots, call logs, voicemails, and notes. He went through everything carefully. Then he looked at me and said, "Keep documenting. Facts matter more than arguments." So that's what I did. I recorded every attempted visit. I saved every message. I checked my mailbox daily and photographed anything that arrived with Megan's name attached to my address. There were school-related forms, forwarded correspondence, and messages suggesting my home had been discussed as a future residence before I had ever agreed to it. That mattered. Not because it automatically proved some dramatic crime, but because it showed this hadn't been a misunderstanding. They had been planning around my house. Then I found messages Megan had sent to Linda. My hands actually went cold reading them. Megan wrote that if she arrived with the children and all their belongings, Claire won't be able to say no in front of them. Linda replied that I would eventually have to let them in. Have to. That one word explained months of pressure. Mom hadn't been trying to reconcile us. She had been encouraging Megan to wear me down until my boundary collapsed. At my attorney's recommendation, I sent a formal written notice stating clearly that neither Megan nor anyone else had permission to establish residence at my property, receive mail there without authorization, or enter without my consent. Megan laughed it off. Mom called it ridiculous. But they didn't know what I had. They didn't know I had screenshots with timestamps. They didn't know I had a complete timeline. And they definitely didn't know I had messages showing that the children and extended family weren't accidental victims of the situation. They had been part of the strategy. That was enough for me. For years, I had reacted to whatever emergency they placed in front of me. Now I was looking behind it. And once I saw the plan clearly, I stopped asking whether I was being too harsh. I started asking what I needed to do to make sure it never happened again. The first person I met with was my mother. I chose a quiet cafe across town, somewhere public enough that neither of us could turn the conversation into a scene. Linda arrived looking confident. She sat down, folded her hands, and said, "I hope you're finally ready to apologize." I put a stack of printed messages on the table. Her expression changed. She picked up the first page, then another. "You went through our messages?" "No," I said. "Megan sent them to me. Accidentally." That wasn't completely true in the way she meant it. But the messages were mine now, and Linda knew exactly what they showed. I looked directly at her. "You kept telling me family should help family. But what you meant was that I should give, and everyone else should decide how much." For once, Mom had nothing ready. She tried calling it a misunderstanding. I didn't argue. I just left the papers on the table. A few days later, Megan asked to meet. She expected tears. An argument. The old Claire, desperately explaining why she wasn't a terrible person. Instead, I brought copies of the written notice. "No more using my address," I told her. "No more showing up unannounced. No more sending people to pressure me." Her face went from red to pale. "So you're threatening me now?" "No. I'm informing you." Then came the tears. "You'd rather see your nieces and nephews suffer?" I felt the guilt rise automatically. And then it passed. "I offered help," I said. "You rejected it because you wanted my house." That ended the conversation. The final confrontation happened without anyone sitting across from me. When relatives started messaging again, I sent one response to the family group. No insults. No accusations. Just dates. Megan's original request. My refusal. My offers to help. The 2 weeks of silence. The moving van. The messages discussing how to pressure me through the children. Then I stopped typing. The silence in that group chat lasted almost an hour. One cousin finally wrote, "Wait, you offered to pay for temporary housing?" Another asked why Megan had told everyone I had simply thrown them out. Suddenly, the questions weren't coming to me anymore. They were going to Megan. That was the real reversal. I didn't need to destroy her story. I just stopped protecting it. Over the following weeks, the calls slowed. Relatives backed away from the arguments. The surprise visits stopped completely. And for the first time, my family understood something the old Claire had never been willing to teach them. My boundaries weren't opening statements. They were final answers. The legal consequences weren't dramatic. There were no handcuffs, no television cameras, no courtroom speech that made everyone suddenly understand what they'd done. Real life was quieter than that, and honestly more effective. My attorney helped me organize everything: the screenshots, the timestamps, the written timeline, the messages about using the children to pressure me, and the documents connected to my address. Then formal notices went out. Megan was told, in writing, that she did not have permission to enter my property, establish residence there, or use my address as her own. Any future unwanted visits or continued harassment would be documented and addressed through the appropriate legal channels. Where information connected to my address needed to be corrected, it was. No revenge. No exaggeration. Just facts being put in the right places. For the first time, Megan had to deal with her housing situation without pretending my home was part of her plan. Linda took it harder than I expected. She called me after receiving a copy of the documentation. "I can't believe you involved lawyers," she said. I stood beside my kitchen window, looking at the same front walk where Megan's suitcases had once been lined up. "You involved them when you decided my no didn't matter." She started crying. Part of me still wanted to comfort her. That old instinct hadn't disappeared overnight. But I finally understood something important. Feeling sorry for someone didn't require me to surrender to them. The family eventually accepted what they should have understood from the beginning. Being related to me did not give them a right to live in my home, use my address, or make decisions about my property. And when Megan tried one last time to turn the situation into something I had done to her, I gave her the only answer I had left. "I didn't take anything from you. I just stopped allowing you to take from me." After that, the arguments lost their power, because there was nothing left to debate. My house was still mine. My boundaries were still mine. And their emergencies were finally theirs to solve. That was the reckoning, not punishment, reality. Several months later, my house was peaceful again. Not the tense kind of quiet where everyone is waiting for the next argument. Real quiet. The kind where I could hear the refrigerator humming from the kitchen and the pages of a book turning in a room that used to sit empty. I'd changed my routines completely. I no longer woke up wondering who needed money, who needed a ride, or which family emergency I was supposed to solve before breakfast. My phone could ring without my stomach tightening. I started seeing my friends again. I accepted invitations I'd spent years declining because somebody in my family always needed something. At work, I finally had enough mental space to focus on my own goals, and within a few months, I earned the promotion I'd been quietly working toward. Then I reclaimed the room. Megan had once casually announced that it would make a perfect bedroom for one of her children. She'd even talked about paint colors before she'd ever asked me. Now I stood inside that same room with a paintbrush in my hand, turning it into something completely mine. A warm little reading room with shelves, a comfortable chair, and a desk by the window. I didn't feel guilty. That surprised me most. Megan eventually found another housing arrangement through her own efforts and the support available to her. Linda stayed distant. There were attempts at reconciliation, but I stopped measuring every conversation by whether she finally understood me. The strangest thing about finally choosing myself was discovering how quiet life became afterward. I didn't celebrate Megan struggling. I didn't celebrate Linda being hurt. I simply stopped carrying problems that weren't mine. For years, I'd confused sacrifice with love and exhaustion with responsibility. Now I understood something simpler. My family didn't have to approve of my boundaries for those boundaries to be real. And my life didn't have to be painful to prove that I cared. For the first time, the peace inside my home belonged entirely to me. If you've ever felt guilty for saying no to someone you love, I want you to remember something. Boundaries make controlling people angry because boundaries expose expectations that were never spoken out loud. The moment you stop doing everything they assumed you'd always do, they may call you selfish, cold, or ungrateful. But their disappointment doesn't automatically mean you've done something wrong. Helping someone is a choice. Surrendering your life is not an obligation. You are allowed to say no, even when someone calls you selfish. You are allowed to protect your home, your money, your time, and your peace. And being family doesn't erase consent. It doesn't give anyone a permanent key to your house, access to your bank account, or unlimited control over your future. I learned that the hard way. For years, I thought keeping the peace meant keeping everyone else comfortable. What I finally understood was that sometimes peace only begins when you stop sacrificing yourself to create it. So, I'm curious about you. If someone in your family arrived at your door with a moving truck and expected you to take them in, what would you have done? Would you have opened the door? Or would you have finally said no? Tell me in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know because chances are someone reading your story has lived through something painfully similar. If this story reminded you of someone, share it with them. And if you want more family drama stories about boundaries, betrayal, and finding the courage to choose yourself, subscribe. They thought my home was the one thing they could take because I was too afraid to say no. They were wrong about the house, but more importantly, they were wrong about me.